Good afternoon. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you for Reason to Resist from Montreal, Canada on December 6, 2024. Nowadays, Europe is in big trouble. The governments of the EU's two biggest countries, Germany and France, have effectively collapsed. European political parties described as far right have surged in popularity. Those parties include the AfD in Germany and the Front National in France. Economic growth is sluggish to non existent in the Union. Debt levels are surging. So, more and more people are asking, can Europe be saved? Now, here to discuss this with me is Glenn Diesen. Glenn is a professor of political science at the University of Southeastern Norway. His research focuses on geoeconomics, Russian foreign policy, and Eurasian integration. And thank you for joining me for the first time on Reason to Resist, Glenn.
Oh, thank you so much for the invitation.
So, Glenn, I'd like to start with the political upheaval in France. Michel Barnier just resigned. Barnier, a conservative, was appointed by French President Emmanuel Macron to be France's new prime minister just 3 months ago. Barnier was forced to resign after a no confidence vote in parliament. This was the first time a no confidence vote forced a French prime minister to resign in more than 60 years. And Barnier's 3-month tenure, I understand, was the shortest tenure of any French prime minister in the history of the modern republic. Now, all of this is happening against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine, which has turned into, I think one can fairly say, an epic debacle for Europe, the US, and NATO. And the pro Ukraine Guardian just published a report which shows that this past November, Russian forces experienced their largest territorial gain since the start of Russia's military intervention in February 2022. I've read numerous reports, Glenn, about Barnier's ouster in the Western press. None of them suggested there was any link between his demise and the war in Ukraine. In your opinion, what are the reasons for the swift demise of Barnier's government, and are these events in France connected to the events in Ukraine?
I would say yes, quite clearly, but it also has a wider background. I think this whole post-Cold War, very globalist approach of France is coming to an end, and I think they're pretty much holding on quite desperately now. So I think this is what Macron's holding on to, not only his own role, but obviously the war in Ukraine is also quite important. Keep in mind, this is not this has been very costly for the Europeans. When they first began, they were told that this war would probably not last very long. The Russian economy could be collapsed fairly quickly by sending weapons in. They would be deterred and eventually capitulate on the battlefield, and the world would isolate them. So it didn't go as planned, and the Europeans' response was to double down. Now, the great irony is that the Europeans saw this coming. If we go back to 2008, when the NATO promised future NATO membership, the Europeans were very much pressured into this, and by the Bush administration at the time. But they all knew that this would be a disaster at the time. Angela Merkel, she recalled that the Russians would consider this to be a declaration of war. It would be not just redivide the continent, which NATO expansion involved, but it would cross a very important red line for Russia. And the Russians keep saying this is an existential threat. So anyways, we ended up in this conflict with Russia, and every time it goes from bad to worse, we end up, that is in Europe, doubling down, escalating further, and sending all our weaponry. And not only by sending weapons and money to Ukraine, but what's happening in Europe as well. When we become more dependent on the United States for security, the Americans know how to use dependence. Immediately, this security dependence is converted into demand for economic loyalty, political obedience, and we see this now. It's not enough for Europe to cut itself off from Russian energy. Now they're told also to cut themselves off from the Chinese technologies and link ourselves more and more to US in relative decline, who's also shifting focus to Asia. So none of this really makes any sense at all. And as Europe goes now into deindustrialization, you would think now common sense would really kick in. But instead, the Americans have come into Europe and offering this Inflation Reduction Act, essentially economic incentives for European industries which can't compete anymore to go across Atlantic to the United States. So they're cannibalizing the industries. Is the French economic minister at the beginning suggested that Russia could be crushed, using very crude and brutal language. And about I think 9 or 12 months ago, the argument was that the Americans this Inflation Reduction Act has become an existential threat to us. So things are shifting, yet the policies remain the same. And I guess this has been the great irony of Macron, because he was the one who called NATO brain dead at some point. He was the one who warned that Europe should not become vassals of America. He's also recognized on several occasions that if Europe should be prosperous, we can't redivide and remilitarize the continent. And he's also on many occasions recognized, if you want stability and prosperity in Europe, you can't really have such a Europe without the largest country in Europe. So this whole project we have in Europe through NATO and EU to construct a continent where everyone is included except for the largest country, Russia, that this was destined to revive all this Cold War logic and war. And this is where we are today, I think. Europe, less economic, prosperous, more politically dependent, and increasingly irrelevant. And this is the context, I think, in which this government collapsed, which you are correct. I think this is the shortest serving prime minister in modern French history.
Yeah. A moment ago, you said it would be viewed as an existential threat by the Russians. I assume you were referring to NATO expansion.
Yes. Also, I should have been a bit more explicit
No
there.
So,
Well, it's an important topic because this is if you can't appreciate that they are genuinely viewing this as an existential threat, something, by the way, many Western leaders used to recognize, then you can't really understand the conflict at all. And I think this reluctance to accept this is why we keep making a lot of mistakes.
And am I correct, Glenn, that the Front National and the coalition of left-wing parties in France's parliament, the L'Assemblée Nationale, they currently command a majority of the seats, and they are very critical of France's policies towards Russia? Is that correct?
Oh, yes. So and this is what you see when a government isn't pursuing its very basic national interests, and instead, taking orders from these international institutions, be it the EU or NATO or the United States. A vacuum will be created in which the opposition parties will insist on pursuing national interests. And national interest is no more of this war, and begin to pursue some common sense and national interest. But this is what happened in France. They had an election. If I'm not mistaken, the Macron's party came in third, but nonetheless, you have through this political, what's a good word, scheming, they end up in a position where Macron nonetheless insists that he should be allowed to set up a government, and he's able to play the right and left off each other, and at the end stab them both in the back. So it's a very temporary solution because none of the problems are addressed, and of course the left and the right realize what's supposed to be done. The voters recognize it, and but they don't accept any substantial change to the politics, which is why France will be ungovernable, I think. But nonetheless, Macron will not step down, as this project has to continue.
Yes, he just made quite clear he intends to stay until 2027. Many Western media organizations, Glenn, are reporting that Barnier's resignation could jeopardize France's ability to deal with its ballooning debt. The country's deficit is estimated to reach 6% of GDP this year, and analysts say it could rise to 7% next year without drastic adjustments. And of course, this is well beyond the requirements that the European Union has imposed on member states for deficit spending. Now, none of the reports I've read in the Western media, and I've read a number of them relating to Barnier's resignation, say anything about French military spending. Barnier was arguing for austerity, including cuts to the education budget, but 1 month ago, his government proposed an increase in France's military spending from 47.2 billion euros in 2024 to 50.5 billion euros in 2025, which is an increase of about 7%. And all over Europe, we are hearing calls for increased military spending as debt levels in the Union climb to fairly dangerous levels, I would say. In your view, does this make any sense? What are the arguments for large increases in military spending in Europe, and do those arguments stand up to scrutiny?
No, but this is not unique to France either. You can look across the border to Germany. They have the same issue. The deindustrializing all the traditional industries, heavy industries, also the car industry, which is quite dramatic there. It's all falling apart very quickly, and there's no room for recovery. They need to have radical economic reforms. Instead, we're seeing them sending money to Ukraine. They're sending all their weaponry to Ukraine, and they're arguing for, oh, now we have to remilitarize, spend billions and billions on weaponry, which they don't have. So it's the same with France. They they need to do something quickly because their economic situation is continues to deteriorate, and uh, this is going to be more and more difficult to fix the longer the wait. Uh, but nothing is being done. There's the cuts are always found somewhere among the population. You know, you can go after school or health sector, whatever you will. But you really need to address, I think, the military. But again, this is not a good time because France insists on that it should push more money into the military. And indeed, this is sort of the French leader source of leadership in Europe. They're very desperate to be seen as a leader, especially Macron. He's kind of the Napoleon that nobody wants to follow. And this situation for him is well, if you have a militarized EU, a geopolitical EU, then leadership was assumed to shift towards the French. If it's an economic EU, the leadership would belong to the Germans. If you introduce a EU army, then the assumption would more of the power would shift towards the French. So the French they don't want to touch the military budget, but at some point they will have to. And what will happen then is some big geopolitical changes as the military might of France begins to decline further. And they want to obviously avoid this, but this is something that's coming, obviously. But no, the overall economic situation is just terrible. We have these rules in the EU, but no one actually, well, not say no one, the most powerful countries do not need to follow it because, you know, this is the EU now. But for the French, they always had this problem. They have high benefits for their workers, or at least they used to. But the main dilemma they have in this new globalized economy is how do you compete? Traditionally, in the capitalist system, you would try to strengthen the collective strength of labor versus more powerful capital. But within the globalist system now with free trade, they have to either continue to push down salaries, they strip them of benefits to be more competitive. Otherwise, the industries, they can't compete internationally. So you see always this downward pressure on labor in order to build enough powerful industries, and you can only push this so far before things begin to crack. And I think we already past this point.
And so, one of the refrains one hears in Europe here and here in North America to justify massive increases in military spending is that if Russia prevails in Ukraine, its forces will move westward and invade one or more NATO countries. And some would even go so far as to claim that Vladimir Putin aspires to reconstitute the Soviet Empire. Um, in your opinion, is there any credible evidence to support the claim that Russia's government and Vladimir Putin in particular have designs on NATO territory?
No, and there's no evidence at all. If there was an evidence, I would have liked to see it. But again, this is even the narrative is all very, very strange because the main argument we've had in NATO is that Ukraine really needs to join NATO because the Russians would never dare to attack a NATO country. So it's imperative that we pull Ukraine into NATO. At the same time, we're saying once the Russians defeated the Ukraine, they're going to attack NATO. So they're going to move on to Poland, the Baltic states. So you can't have it both ways. Either, Ukraine should join NATO because they don't dare to attack a NATO country, or you know, you can't then at the same time argue that they're going to attack NATO after Ukraine. But this is kind of it's all narratives now. Doesn't have to be any logic. And but the premise of this whole idea is that anything that Russia does is in a vacuum. That is, how do you explain this war? Well, it's military opportunism. They went for territory. They want to restore the Soviet Union. Everything is about decisions made within Russia. Putin wants to strengthen his position. All this stuff, because we're not allowed, and I would emphasize that word, allowed, to discuss Russian security concerns. This is something remarkable we have in the West for more than 30 years now. Nobody, media, politicians, nobody wants to discuss the fact that Russia has security concerns, or that we stepped all over them, because, and this is why we always focused on this war, that it was unprovoked. This is the slogan everyone have to adhere to. It's a bit like in the Middle East, where we all have to first condemn Hamas before we're allowed to speak about conflict. First we have to recognize that it was unprovoked, because if it's unprovoked, it means that this again happened in a vacuum. But I think it's very false. Go before 2014. No one in Moscow was laying any claims to any territories in Ukraine. None of the Ukrainians were worried about Russia. Back in 2014, only 20% of Ukrainians even wanted to join NATO. There was no security competition, rivalry between the two states. The only thing that triggered this was the coup in 2014 and the quite obvious objective, which was to pull Ukraine into NATO's orbit. This is what sparked the security competition. Again, for Russia, this was seen as an existential threat, so they took drastic measures. They took Crimea, they supported the uprising in Donbass, and suddenly, of course, yes, now the Ukrainians have real concerns. But this idea that it started in a vacuum, and it's very strange, and it reflects this reluctance to address the key issue that we are the one who has been threatening Russian security as well.
Right. I think, as I recall, in fact, the Russian Federation was paying somewhere in the range of $100 million a year, the equivalent of $100 million a year, to rent the naval facilities at Sebastopol in Crimea, which historically had belonged to Russia for a many long time. So clearly, prior to 2014, if they're actually paying rent for the use of Sebastopol, that would strongly suggest there were no designs prior to the coup by the Russian government on Ukrainian territory. But in any event, I'd like to move now to Germany. And in November, Glenn, as you know quite well, Germany's coalition government also collapsed. That coalition was comprised of Chancellor Olaf Scholz's Social Democrats, Vice Chancellor Robert Habeck's Greens, and Christian Lindner's Free Democrats. It collapsed in early November when Scholz fired Finance Minister Lindner following disagreements over how to revive Germany's ailing economy. Now, many expect Germany's parliament to hold a confidence vote this month. If it does so, it seems likely that Scholz will lose, which would precipitate an election in early 2025. And interestingly, since his coalition collapsed, Scholz has suddenly developed an apparent appetite for peace talks in the Ukraine war. And so in mid-November, he held an hour-long phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin. This was the first direct communication, I understand, between the two men in nearly 2 years. Predictably, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky reacted harshly to the phone call, saying that Scholz was opening up a Pandora's box. And I also understand that the reports I saw suggested that Scholz, in his recent visit to Ukraine after his call with Putin, was having serious discussions with Zelensky about what a peace deal might look like. What do you think is going on here? Do you think that Scholz actually has a genuine desire to finally bring this war to a merciful end, or is this all just posturing in advance of an election in which voters are going to, one of the issues they're going to be very interested in Germany is what are the candidates' position with respect to the Ukraine war? So is this just theater, or do you think it's real?
Well, it has. It could be a bit of both. The theater, I think, is obvious because the part of the reason why this collapsed as well was the disagreement over sending the Taurus missiles, which would be will amount to a direct attack by Germany on Russia. So, given Germany's history of invading Russia, this is sensitive. Anyways, I think the public turned very quickly against this. They did not want this, and so I think he could find himself on the right side of the issue, if you will, something that can allow him to survive politically as well. So suddenly Scholz became the guy arguing for peace. Now I think that's the theater of the whole thing, but it might also have um, some real developments, because if you look at the battlefield, what has happened? This has been a war of attrition in which you gradually bleed the adversary. The Russians have won the war effectively. We see that over the past few months. The Ukrainians are exhausted. The front lines are now collapsing. And what happens in a war of attrition when the front collapses? Well, this is when territories are captured. And this is what you now see as well. The territorial acquisitions will begin to intensify. So the war is coming to an end. And at the same time, we see Donald Trump being elected in the United States. He wants an end to the war. So I think it's quite... we essentially have two different options now, and this is what NATO's been faced with throughout the whole war. When Ukraine begins to struggle or fail, what do? You can either escalate or you can negotiate. And this last round of escalation, with attacking Russia directly with these long-range missiles, which is effectively a NATO attack on Russia. It's not merely helping Ukraine. I think this is it's probably for many in Germany a step too far as well. So it is, it is problematic. But so going and talking to Putin, you would think this wouldn't be very problematic. So I'm not sure what Pandora box of diplomacy he fears so much, but this is part of the very strange mentality which has become normalized now across the West, which is the idea that, oh no, we don't talk to adversaries, we isolate them, we don't want to talk to them, as if this is a sign of virtue. So, and this is what we've been doing for almost 3 years. We sit on the sideline, watch hundreds of thousands of young men dying, even especially then mostly the Ukrainians, which we pretend to care about. We see them perish. Through diplomacy, we could have avoided some of the excess of violence. We could have put some limitations. We could have possibly even negotiated a peace. But instead, we did the exact opposite. Boycotted all diplomacy and said, "Oh, look how virtuous we are. We don't talk to the bad Russians." Or as the EU foreign policy chief Kallas proudly proclaimed, "Oh, Putin is a war criminal. We don't talk to war criminals. This is how good we are." Even though it could have saved a lot of lives. So this is the kind of nonsense. But I
They
wouldn't.
didn't talk to war criminals. How does she explain their communications with Benjamin Netanyahu? But
Oh no, but that's a good genocide.
yes, exactly.
No, but I think there's there's a lot of opposition emerging in Germany as well, both on the right, which is AfD, and also on the left, where you see huge changes. And this is because, again, the political parties all conform to what Washington asked for. And the Americans were very clear in the beginning of 2022 when they sabotaged the Istanbul peace agreement. They wanted a long war. Zelensky, he recognized this. He even said it in an interview with The Economist in March of 2022 that there's Western countries who want a long war with Russia so they can exhaust it, even if it will destroy us, he said. And this is what the Americans wanted, and this is what they're asking the Europeans to do, and this is why it's continuing. And but as long as the main parties follow this very foolish policy, of course it's going to create a vacuum in which new opposition appears both on the right and left. And the Germans, of all the Europeans, they might be the most hapless, pathetic. I'm not sure what word to go for, but if you look at the Nord Stream, this is truly amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, keep in mind what has happened here. The Americans, they when this all began, they said, obviously it's the Russians. The Russians did this, and they used this to legitimize bringing Finland, Sweden into NATO. It was also reasoning for why we had to militarize the Baltic Sea. It was a reason for why we had to intensify or escalate the war in Ukraine. And then now the Americans are saying, oh, no, well, it wasn't the Russians. We knew all along it wasn't the Russians. It was the Ukrainians, and we weren't able to stop it. Obviously, I don't buy this either. But it's fascinating that I admit now that they knew about this before it happened, because this means that this is the admission. They lied. They lied about the Russians being behind it so they can escalate war. There's no other possible explanation. How else can you? So it's amazing. And the Germans, they, instead of being concerned, the Americans attacked our energy infrastructure. Now we're deindustrializing, and they're sending in all this, and what remains of our industries are being lured across to the United States, and they gave a medal to Joe Biden or
in Germany,
standing up for Western civilization or some nonsense. It's just
they rewarded him for blowing up their pipeline and their economy. It was quite
exactly something. No, it's complete subordination. And of course, then when you humiliate yourself in this way, you don't stand up for national interest anymore. Of course, you're going to have a whole new opposition emerging on the right and left, which doesn't conform to this new consensus, which undermines them. So it's it's quite remarkable.
Yeah. There's something I'm very curious about, Glenn. I'd like to know your thoughts on this. In this sort of unfolding dialogue in the West about what a peace deal might look like, I don't think anybody from any major government has put on the table a proposal that there's any realistic chance of the Russians accepting. But what appears to be the consensus appears to be that Ukraine should freeze the conflict. There'll be a demilitarized zone, and Ukraine, and even Zelensky, I think, has indicated his assent to this. They will not try to recover the lands currently occupied by Russia by military means. He'll somehow try to accomplish that by diplomatic means somewhere down the road. But I think this can be fairly described as a concession on the territorial front, even though they're not saying we're going to recognize Russia's permanent sovereignty over these parts of 1991 Ukraine. They're saying we're going to stop trying to recover them by military means. But on the other hand, I haven't seen any willingness at all from any major Western government or Ukraine to concede on the point of Ukraine's membership in NATO, which I think you quite rightly indicated was the primary factor in the eruption of this war. And I would have thought that would be the easier point for them to concede upon, and that giving up territory would be a much harder ask. Why do you think they are being so stubborn about Ukraine's membership in NATO when they themselves promised the leadership of the Soviet Union that NATO would not expand eastward in exchange for the Soviet Union's assent to the reunification of Germany? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, there probably has two reasons. One would be the format we have for Europe, because when the Cold War came to an end, keep in mind we actually had the agreements with Russia for a pan-European security architecture. Of course, we made the promises, as referred to Gorbachev, but also in 1990 we actually did sign the Charter of Paris for a New Europe, in which we wouldn't have more dividing lines. We would have indivisible security. This is also why we developed the OSCE in 94. Even Bill Clinton warned in January of 94 that if we do start to expand NATO, we're going to redivide the continent again. This is why, George Kennan, not Matthew Perry. What is this? Anyways, it's been a long day. Anyways, a lot of the heavyweights in Washington began to argue very strongly against this, because this was foolish. So
I think you might have been thinking about William Perry.
William Perry, sorry, yeah. William Perry, yeah. So sorry, So he even made a point that everyone in the Bill Clinton administration recognized that this was a massive provocation, and and he even considered quitting his position in protest. So, but as he argued, everyone recognized this was foolish. But who cares? That was the main argument. Russia's weak; it's getting weaker again. This was the 90s. We can afford to make them our enemies again. So, and like people like Madeleine Albright argued, okay, at least yes, we expand NATO. They will see this as surrounding them. It will be threatening. However, if we have a conflict, at least we'll have them surrounded by NATO. So we knew all along that what would happen. But anyways, this has been kind of the main expansion of NATO, and NATO becoming the main security institution in Europe. So if we admit no more NATO expansion, it puts a halt to this whole argument, what we organized all of European security over. I mean, if you want to explain to a non-European or non-Westerner the logic of, the main recipe for stability was just to expand the military bloc, anti-Russian military alliance closer and closer to the Russian border, and this was the recipe for stability and peace, they might, have some questions at least, but we do not have questions. And so if we do admit this, then it could be the end of this whole era. And I think the second issue is, once we take NATO membership off the table, we essentially admit that this was the source of the war, because the main thing NATO is saying now, if it hadn't been for NATO, as the NATO Secretary General says, Ukraine would not have been able to defend itself, as if Russia would have swallowed the whole country, which they never wanted or still don't want. But instead, they would have to admit that, we knew that NATO expansion would trigger a war. Again, in 2014, we knew it would start a war. We knew only 20% of Ukrainians even wanted NATO, and we did it anyways. And so because of NATO, we now have hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dead, loss of 20% of their territory, a huge war in Europe, and we're at the brink of nuclear war, that this was the source of it. It's very hard to turn back, and it's easier just to say that Putin is a very, very bad man, everything was unprovoked, and focus on territory, because as long as you talk about territory, it suggests that this is the source of the war, but it's not. This is the symptom, this is the result, and this is why it's also important to look at Istanbul in 2022, because at this point the Russians, as we learned from all the sources, the Russians were willing to pull back completely to where they had been in return for Ukraine to restore its neutrality. So the main objective was end to NATO expansion. And this is what we took off the table. And now, of course, we do have a territorial dispute. But so I think this is the main reason why we don't want to talk about it.
So I'd like to turn to another part of Europe, and that is Romania, which just held the first round of its presidential election. And the front runner after the first round is a person by the name of Calin Georgescu. In advance of the second round, which will be held, I understand, this Sunday, Georgescu is promising to end aid to Ukraine. Now, Glenn, the Western media described Georgescu as far right. Now, before this election, I had never actually heard of him before, but when I saw the designation of far right, which I sometimes have questions about how we use that term in the so-called mainstream discourse in the West, his record raises serious questions to my mind about this characterization. So from 2010 to 2012, Georgescu was a special rapporteur in the office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And I understand from 2015 to 2016, he was the executive director of the UN Global Sustainable Index Institute. That doesn't really sound like far-right activity to me, but what do you make of this description of Georgescu as far-right? Do you think it's a fair description? And if so, why or why not?
Well, it did take me a bit by surprise as well, because it appeared to come out of nowhere. But no, I don't think it's a fair description. But this is the labeling we use to delegitimize others. Look at the other leaders who actually come to power in Europe. If you look at Fico in Slovakia or Orban in Hungary, what happens? They're calling for an end to the war. Effectively, the majority of Ukrainians also want an end to the war. Just to make this point, there's not a single oblast left in Ukraine where majority wants to continue fighting. So, but on our side, we see the Americans pushing to instead lower the conscription age to 18, so we can send more young men to die. So there's the same common sense, but we never discuss the arguments of Slovakia or Hungary. Instead, what do we say? Oh, they are they're Putin puppets. And so when the I'll forget his name now again, but when you have this new Romanian contender looking to possibly win, then this is the same thing we use. Far right, or they even call them hard right, extreme right, all these words to discredit, because once it's discredited, we don't have to deal with his arguments anymore. It's just he's a bit extreme. He might be working for the Russians, and suddenly, yeah, he's effectively criminalized. And this also allows certain amount of way to use undemocratic means to also to essentially crush him. And this is not a exaggerated thing to say, because look in Germany, when the main opposition now has become AfD because of opposition to war. Well, what do they say? Well, both politicians and the media talk about banning the main opposition because they are dangerous. They're far right. In Italy, they might put Salvini in jail. In France, they might put Le Pen in jail. This is who we have become now. Same as in Moldova. This was just an election. This was the most fraudulent election the EU has ever manipulated or pushed, I think. This was incredible. And still, this is what they done, because they said, well, the alternative, who's the alternative? Well, he's pro-Putin. He's essentially betraying Europe. Europe is democracy. That means you can only pursue EU, otherwise you're not democratic. And the same goes now in Romania.
Right.
These people will emerge, because this is not in our interest to redivide the continent, militarize it, and throw away our economies. It's quite foolish. If we wanted to, the common sense would be to end this war, have some economic contacts with Russia to the extent it's in our benefit, and end the subordination to the United States. But anyone who suggests it suddenly become hard right, far right, and we won't talk about them anymore.
So if Georgescu wins in Romania, he'll join two individuals you just mentioned, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban and Slovakian Prime Minister Robert Fico, as critics of EU support for Ukraine. Romania seems to have played a pretty important role in NATO's military support for Ukraine. Do you think that potentially, if Georgescu wins and sticks by his position that his country will end support for Ukraine's war effort, which presumably would mean no more weaponry passing through Romania to Ukraine, do you think that has the potential to be a game changer in terms of European policy towards the Ukraine war? Or do you think they'll simply find a way to circumvent or crush his opposition to the Ukraine war effort?
Well, the question remains if he's allowed to win, and if it's allowed to, if he wins, allowed to actually pursue the policies he suggests. But no, you're correct. I mean, the two key entry points into Ukraine, in which the NATO countries send weapon, is through Poland and Romania. You find a lot of the logistics centers, and the general supplies. Now, obviously, Romania has some benefits coming up from the south, next to the Black Sea. It's easier, perhaps, to supply Odessa, but it will make NATO too reliant on Poland, which affects overall supplies. But it also would then create more congestion and easier targets for the Russians if they want to take out some of the weaponry. So it would definitely put a clear dent into NATO's proxy war on Russia. By the way, Boris Johnson recently said, yes, this is a proxy war against Russia. So now we're apparently allowed to say this. Before it was Russian propaganda. But anyways, I think this will impact greatly the war. But it's also the political aspect, which is, when it was only Orban trying to appease, going to Ukraine, going to Russia, China, trying to see if there was a diplomatic path to peace, the EU responded by punishing him, by punishing Hungary. because this was dangerous. He was breaking with the EU consensus, a consensus which is upheld by coercion, by the way. But now, of course, when the Slovakians have joined in, and now possibly Romania as well, it's going to be very hard to keep the pro-war consensus up. Also, because you're seeing the pressure build up. The Italians have also begun to turn a bit cold against this whole escalation of the war. And again, you see whoever continues this war policy, be it the Germans or the French, cracks will begin to emerge as well, because these are truly mad policies.
Yeah, I think Giorgia Meloni may be looking at what's happening in France, Germany, Romania, and elsewhere, and wondering whether she'll be next if she continues to support this war effort. But I want to talk to you about the impact of Donald Trump on all of this. He, of course, has, during his first term, was quite critical of NATO, constantly, regularly chastised European governments, other NATO governments, for not spending enough money on their military. Although his cabinet selections tend to be quite prone to war, he did campaign on a promise to end the Ukraine war. And my question to you is, and I know this is a difficult question to answer, Glenn. It involves a lot of sort of prognostication in a complex political environment. But if, in fact, Russia does achieve a point on the battlefield where it can effectively dictate the terms of surrender to Ukraine, so it's simply now no longer possible for anybody to argue with a straight face that Ukraine has not lost this war, and Trump accedes in some manner to the reality that Ukraine is defeated. Do you think that NATO can survive this? And if it can, in its current form, I mean, and if you think it can't, what, if anything, do you think is likely to replace NATO? Might there be a smaller NATO? Would we just have, independent European states that aren't part of any formal military alliance with the United States? Or what is your expectation about this?
The future of NATO. Yeah, that's interesting. Can I just make one more comment on the Trump? Because I just have to point out that many people take him now almost as a given, but he is a bit of a wild card, because he doesn't care too much about NATO. He's willing to take it off the table, it appears. So he has everything you need to end the war, and also he wants to end the war within 24 hours. So there's reason to be optimistic about peace, but he also prides himself as being the ultimate deal maker. And when he pushes, put a lot of pressure and bullying, threatening to bring hell on earth unless they take the offer. So, but again, they don't have much of an offer. They don't have much bargaining power anymore with the Russians, and the Russians have demands which are quite difficult to sell on the home market. They want restoring Ukraine's neutrality, which is no more NATO, and they also want territorial concessions. That is, the four oblasts which were lost, they has to be accepted, and of course restoring the basic human rights, democracy, religious rights to minorities in Ukraine. So it's going to be very hard to get all of this, and so if Trump doesn't get what he wants, and he then starts to max pressure, he might just end up as another Biden. So it's not clear he will push this peace, but so it seems more and more likely this will be solved on the battlefield, which begs the question how Trump would react. That being said, it's the future of NATO, I think, is in question, because obviously when you have an external threat, the main thing that happens is everyone rallies and push for internal solidarity against the external threat. This is very basic in human nature, but. And then the NATO keeps making this point that Putin has made the alliance stronger than ever. Now he wanted less NATO on his border, as Stoltenberg said. Now he has more, as if this was an objective on its own. But beyond I think below this rhetoric, there's definitely a lot of cracks emerging. As the Hungarians pointed out, they wanted to join a defensive alliance to have security, not to join an alliance which will go to war against the world's largest nuclear power, which hasn't attacked them. I mean, this is pure madness. And I think once the war is over, and there has to be some reckoning of what we've done to our security, to our economy, and all the lies that have been told. and because we could have this war could have been avoided very easily, and it wasn't. So at this point in time, I think NATO itself can come under immense pressure, and it could crack. Again, the basics of it has always been that the Americans offer security to Europe, and in return they get influence on the continent, a final say. There's always been this pressure. The Americans want the Europeans to pay a bit more. The Europeans want to have more political autonomy, and there's always been this bit of wrestling. But now, of course, the Europeans have made themselves so dependent on the United States that they are, that they're willing to subordinate themselves completely. Meanwhile, the United States has less to offer in terms of security, and the reduced or the much fewer. The relative power in decline, it's not even going to be focused on Europe. They've made it quite clear their main interest is in Asia. It doesn't matter if it's Republican or Democrats, they will go to Asia. So they have less to offer Europe, and they don't want to focus too much on Europe. And meanwhile, Europe is subordinating itself completely. In my country, in Norway, we're opening up American military bases left and right, which we never accepted before, in the hope that the Americans will not forget us, that we will increase our market value in Washington's calculations. This can't be sustained. This is, I think something's going to go wrong. At this point, you can either have a failing military alliance which tries to reassert its purpose, which is very dangerous, or you can just have a crack with a big power vacuum emerging. I'm hoping that if we see a decline in NATO, which could be positive, because we did aspire at one point in time to overcome bloc politics, but we should go back to the idea of having an inclusive pan-European security system, one not against non-members, but one which seeks security with other members, a bit like what the French and Germans did after World War II. I think this is where we have to go, but there's not so much optimism in me anymore, and trust in the rationality of our European leaders.
Certainly not the current crop of them.
No.
I completely concur with you. The last thing I want to talk to you about, Glenn, is your recent article regarding Joe Biden's pardoning of his son, Hunter Biden. And just by way of background for those of our audience members who aren't too familiar with this, you describe in your article that back in 2014, 3 months after the U.S.-backed coup in Ukraine, Hunter Biden and a close family friend of U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry became board members of a Ukrainian energy company called Burisma. And the compensation which Burisma agreed to pay to Hunter Biden for serving as a board member was $50,000 a month, despite Hunter Biden having no expertise in the gas industry, which was Burisma's business, or in Ukraine. Now, after reading your article, I checked the data on board compensation for S&P 500 companies, and this year, 2024, the average total compensation for S&P 500 board members is $327,000 a year. Burisma was not big enough to be an S&P 500 company. I don't think if it was remotely close to big enough to be an S&P 500 company. And yet 7 years ago, it was paying to Hunter Biden an amount that is almost twice as big as the average compensation for S&P 500 directors in 2024. So it seems to be, to me at any rate, that the only plausible reason for Burisma to pay that much money to Hunter Biden is that his father was vice president of the United States and had more or less been assigned by then President Barack Obama to manage U.S. Interests in Ukraine. So my question to you, Glenn, is what do we know other than the stratospheric compensation that Burisma agreed to pay to Hunter Biden for inexplicable reasons? What do we know about Joe Biden's dealings with Burisma? And what evidence is there, in your view, that there was actual corruption involving the current president of the United States back in 2014?
Well, we know that how do you prove corruption? You would have a general prosecutor perhaps investigating it. And this is what Ukraine had. They had a general prosecutor Viktor Shokin, who opened a corruption case against Burisma simply because of the the corruption there, and this, of course, then also then involved Hunter Biden. So what did his father do, Joe Biden? Well, he then pressured for Shokin to be fired. He effectively withheld economic aid to Ukraine unless they would fire their general prosecutor. And some might say, "Oh, this sounds like maybe a conspiracy theory," but he did this in front of camera. He was bragging about it, how much power he was able to wield over Kiev. And this is something that Shokin later on made argument about as well. He said after the coup, the United States, they began to take key control over the main parts of government. Keep in mind that in 2014, the Americans put in their own an American to take over the role as finance minister of Ukraine, Natalia Yaresko. She used to work at the American embassy in Kiev. And then in 2014, they gave her a Ukrainian passport on the same day she became the finance minister. So day one, you represent American interest in Ukraine. Day two, you represent Ukraine. You're the finance minister. So this was taking over. And again, this is what was different from 2004. Because keep in mind, we'd done all this before, but Ukrainians voted to restore, some common sense. But the Americans thought to take over key control over the economy, to shift a lot of this interest to US. So this was something everyone did. What was unique with Biden is he put his son into the game effectively, and his son doesn't have, he has a bit of a problematic personality and history as well, which draws a lot of attention to him. And as you said, he doesn't have any background in energy or Ukraine, yet he had this high paid position. And as we learned later on from the Biden laptop, he would get his father involved in this businesses of his, and it was a way of running Ukraine, running part of its energy sector. We learned this back in 2023, in which it was Devon Archer who then was a business partner of Hunter Biden, who argued that not just Hunter Biden, but Joe Biden had been deeply involved in running Burisma and using Hunter as a way of influencing or speaking to the U.S. government as well. Anyways, Hunter Biden's been a huge problem ever since. Keep in mind that as he was pardoned, a key issue was also, of course, this Hunter Biden, the laptop scandal. And this is a story of massive fraud in U.S. election. People get upset and argue it's a conspiracy theory when they said that the election of 2020 was stolen. Well, one first have to unpack what this means, because what did happen in 2020 was this Biden laptop came out. It showed a lot of corruption by Joe Biden and his son, you would think this would influence the election, but instead you had, much like in the first Russiagate hoax, you had 50 intelligence officers signing a letter that this was Russian disinformation, and then they pressured the Twitter, Facebook, all of them to essentially ban the story from being shared. Even Mark Zuckerberg has admitted this, that they were pressured into censoring the Hunter Biden laptop story. So this was huge election interference. And so this whole story of Hunter Biden, it's obviously a story many would like to see go away, because it's been, the whole pardon as well. Keep in mind, it wasn't only for some gun and tax issues he was pardoned. He was pardoned for all crimes he has done and may have done, so maybe crimes he hasn't been accused of yet, between 1st of January 2014 and to the present date. So it's more than 10 years. It's 11 years, which happens to be the exact time period of the Biden family's involvement in Project Ukraine. So this is, I call it also Joe Biden pardoning himself, because if you want to take him down, you probably will go through his son. So it's it's a crazy scandal, but it shows what is happening related to former discussion in the democracy across the West. It's it's not doing well.
Yeah, with potentially dire consequences for us all living in this part of the world. Glenn, thank you so much for your time. It's been a great privilege speaking with you, and I hope we can do this again in the future.
I've been looking forward to speaking with you. So yeah, definitely, anytime.
And this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Montreal for Reason to Resist on December 6th, 2024.